We're nearing the end of chapter 4, which is quite a thing. It's an achievement. And this is the chapter that is spoken to the heart of Machshava, Dibur, and Maaseh. Thought, speech, and action. The so-called garments of the soul. Everybody tends to believe that an neshama is the ultimate. That's about as great and as spiritual and as developed as a person will ever become. And then we said, hang on a second. That's actually true if you're looking at the person. In terms of the human experience, yes, the greatest experience of being human that you could ever have is to experience your neshama, to experience your soul. The truth, though, is that there's something greater than even your experience of your soul. Because at the end of the day, the reality is that whatever we experience, even if it's deeply spiritual, still remains finite. And what we really want to achieve is access to the infinite, or to infinite. I don't think you can put the definite article "the" in front of the word infinite. It doesn't really make sense. So our goal is, how do you access infinite? And we touched on this last week when we spoke about the difference between one experience in this life versus an entire lifetime in the next world. The next world is compelling, it's exciting, it's spiritual, it's uplifting, it's exposure to the divine presence, and yet all of that still has its limitations. Whereas one moment in this world where you engage, where you can do a mitzvah, where you can engage in teshuvah, that is an infinite experience. And so really that's where we're going with all of this. Thought and speech and action are the tools that I use to learn Torah and to do mitzvahs. And any time that I'm studying Torah or doing mitzvahs, I'm directly connected to the mainframe. I'm plugged into the essence. I extend myself and transcend myself. I go beyond the finite and I connect to Hashem himself. Now the thing about Torah is, and so we're going to focus very much on Torah in this particular conversation. The thing about Torah is that when you learn Torah, you don't necessarily feel that degree of connection or of holiness or of spirituality or of infinity. That's the truth. What happens when we learn Torah? If we're honest about it, what happens when we learn Torah? We gain information. We maybe feel inspired. I had a very interesting conversation the other day. Very interesting in another shir. And the conversation was that it's a mistake to think that Torah is intellect. And when we had this conversation, the people were like, what are you talking about? Obviously the Torah is intellect. It's supreme intellect. It's the most brilliant intellect that you will ever encounter. Look how much wisdom there is, for example, in the Gemara, in the Talmud. Amazing insight into the legal areas of life, into the philosophical areas of life. It touches on the spiritual. It is so expansive and it is so full. How could you say it's not intellect? How could a person suggest such a thing? Well, here's the thing. Intellect, or the intellectual process, that is something that is relatable to whether you're a human or if you're some other developed spiritual being that has a brilliant intellect. It's a relatable experience. In other words, okay, let's not talk so abstract, because that actually defeats the purpose. Let's break this down. Now, before I say anything else, let's break this down. What does that tell you when a person says that? Let's break this down. Let's simplify. Let's illustrate using a metaphor or a parable or a story. All of those things effectively capture what the intellectual process is all about. The intellectual process is that there's information out there, there's an idea out there that is so abstract and so complex that I don't really understand it. So I use my intellect, or I rely on somebody else to use their intellect to break it down, to simplify it, to define it, to describe it, to illustrate it. In other words, the whole process of intellect is to take big things and make them bite-sized. Or to put it differently, the process of intellect is to grab information and bring it into my reality, on my terms, so that I can understand it. In other words, the intellectual process can become quite self-absorbed. I need you to explain that to me in terms that I can understand. Now, sometimes what happens when you explain something in terms that another person can understand is you actually lose some of the value of what it is that you're explaining. Because the way that you understand it, let's say that a person is an expert in a particular area of Judaism. So the way that they understand it and the way that they explain it to somebody else is going to be very, very different. So the process of intellect is effectively diminishing the power of something so that I can absorb it into my head. Torah is the exact opposite. Torah is expanding my experience so that I can transcend myself to connect to something that is fundamentally beyond me. It's the exact opposite. Intellect wants to break things down for me so that I can digest that information. And Torah wants me to transcend myself so that I can access something fundamentally beyond me. Completely different experiences. So is that what happens when you learn Torah? Do you automatically feel that? Is that how you feel when you learn Torah? You feel, wow, I am now transcending myself. Let's talk now. We're in a Tanya class together right now. So right now, do you feel that you're transcending yourself? Do you feel that you're connecting to infinite divine essence? Is that what you feel? Or do you feel, okay, this is a little bit of a challenging subject, but hopefully by the end of this, he'll explain it a little bit better, and then I'll understand what on earth is going on over here, and then I'll feel good, and I'll be able to say, wow, I really love Tuesday evenings because we have a Tanya shir, and we get to learn things that normally we wouldn't even talk about. So that's the issue with Torah, you see. Whenever we learn Torah, it's always in disguise. And the question is, how much disguise? We're about to celebrate Purim. We're going to take out the Megillah. And we know, even before we open the scroll, we know that it is a story in disguise. How do we know? Because that's the name of the book. Megillas Esther. Esther means to conceal. So we know that this is a book where the real information is concealed. It's probably the most honest name of a Torah book that exists because it tells us straight that what you see is not what you get. And there are layers and layers behind. So you open up the Megillah and you read a story. There was a man. His name was Achashverosh. Okay. Now you can have a whole discussion. Which Persian king is Achashverosh? Is it this one or is it that one? And then you read that Achashverosh was not necessarily suitable to be a king. The Megillah says, Ha-moilech. He came into the position of ruling from Hoidu to Cush, which either were very close or very far from each other. So ostensibly, this is a story of an inept leader of a massive empire. Hey, this could have happened in the 21st century. We know a few of those, right? People who are in powerful leadership positions and we're not quite sure why. Like, what did they do to get there? And then he makes this massive feast. And he invites all the king's horses and all the king's men. And you're reading this and you're thinking, do you see connection to the infinite? Do you see the divine essence? Or do you see the anecdotal story of a drunken king who should never have been on that throne in the first place, who didn't know how to treat his wife appropriately, and then when she did not, she was unwilling to compromise for his ridiculous expectations, he has her killed. So there's two ways you could learn Torah. You could learn just viewing things as they appear, the so-called disguise, or you could dig. Most of the time, we just encounter the disguise. You open up a Gemara. What does the Gemara talk about? What happens if somebody has an ox and another person has a cow, and the person's ox attacks and gores the other person's cow? How much does he have to pay? How do you calculate who is liable? Okay, very nice. I don't believe it's ever going to happen to me in my life. I might reverse into somebody else's car, and then you could ask the question, who has to pay what? But the likelihood of having an ox that belongs to me goring a cow that belongs to you, I don't believe it's going to happen to me in this incarnation. So you learn the Gemara and you say, all right, it's very nice, and we understand that you're creating certain basic fundamental principles of legal process, but it's not practical, it's not relevant in my life. Or you read a story about the Ben Sorer Umoire, this outlier, wild case of a juvenile delinquent who in the course of 6 months at exactly the right age becomes such a rogue that he steals from his parents and he eats meat like nobody could imagine and drinks wine like an absolute alcoholic. And in that short period of time, he's going to, but don't worry, it's never happened in history. And then you think to yourself, so why am I learning this stuff? It's bizarre, it's unrelatable, it's never going to happen. And you're telling me that this is a connection directly to the essence of God? It's a little difficult for us to relate to. And so the Alter Rebbe wants to address that in the latter part, towards the end, or as we round off the chapter. He wants to deal with exactly this issue. So what happens when you encounter Torah that ostensibly is direct line into the essence of God, but it really does not feel that way? So how does this all work? That's what he's going to explain to us in the next piece. So it's the second line of what's on the screen. The reality of our experience of Torah is that it appears to us, it is delivered to us, completely wrapped in wrapping paper. You know, like the kids play that pass the parcel game? You know, and you pass around the parcel and the music stops and then you remove a few layers of the wrapping. Maybe you get a prize, maybe you don't. The music starts again, you pass it on again. The way that Hashem presented the Torah to us is wrapped up in layers and layers of very menial, mundane, physical stories and legal cases. So if I'm looking, and this is why people get so frustrated, if I'm looking for inspiration, and I'm looking for meaning, and I'm looking for transcendence, I want to run off to a mountain in Nepal, because that's where they do this stuff. They'll teach me how to sit in the lotus position for hours on end, humming a particular mantra until I levitate. And then I'll know that I've achieved something spiritual. And what's the alternative? Lahavdil. Go sit in a yeshiva in Jerusalem for 6 hours in a row, debating the nuance of exactly who has to pay if one guy is carrying an earthenware jug on his shoulder and the other guy is carrying a large beam, and the guy carrying the beam pauses for breath and the other guy walks and smashes his jug into the other guy's beam. I'm going to spend 6 hours analyzing this. Just tell me tachlis, bottom line. Who is liable for the damages? Why do I have to know that this rabbi says X and that rabbi says Y, and this one bases it on that particular verse, and we compare it to some completely unrelated area of Jewish law, and you get to the point where you feel that you're just playing mental games without necessarily feeling spiritual connection. Why? Because because the wrapping, the appearance, the filters that are applied to the Torah deal with very, very physical things. Here's another example. If you were to write a book, let's just assume that you wanted to start your own religion tomorrow. Now, I don't necessarily recommend it, although there's probably good money in it. So let's say that you wanted to start your own religion tomorrow, yes? In order to start a religion, you probably need 3 things. You need to claim that you've had some kind of divine prophetic revelation. By the way, 99% of religions, you don't need anybody to ever corroborate that you had that experience, so that's fine. Just tell everybody that you had a divine experience. The second thing you need is you'll need some followers who can go out there and tell everybody how amazing you are and why they should follow your religion. And then you're going to need a book. You're going to need some kind of a book that people can refer to, and that book will be the book of enlightenment, the path to your soul. Or you could create some new word that nobody has ever heard of, and you could say the path to whatever your new made-up word is. One thing's for sure, if you want to launch a successful religion tomorrow, that book must talk gobbledygook. It's really important. It must talk abstract spiritual concepts that people will ooh and ah over and will never be able to test if they are real or not. That's how you're going to make a successful, that's how it's going to work. You're going to make a successful religion. So you're going to tell people, use words that they can't relate to, make them feel stupid if they don't understand what they are. Oh, you have not yet achieved the connectivity. You have not yet experienced the serene soul. You know, use that kind of stuff, and people will buy into it. The worst way to try and sell a book that is supposed to be about transcendence and spiritual growth and connection to your soul and connection to God is to start your book by saying, okay, there were these people and they had one job, just one job to do. Their job was not to eat one kind of fruit. Guess what? They ate it. Oh, nirvana. I feel completely connected after reading that story. I feel that I've been transplanted into another spiritual reality. But that's nothing. That's the story that we all know, the story of human failure. So you look, okay, maybe the next story will be more inspiring. What's the next story? There was a guy who killed his brother. There weren't too many other people to kill, so he killed his brother. There's a whole debate whether he committed genocide or homicide because of what percentage of the population Abel was. And then you go on and you read these wonderful stories about the nation that wanted to build a tower to climb up into the heavens and battle against God, or the people who were so promiscuous that Hashem had to drown everybody in a flood. Or you read the story, wonderful story. And I always wonder what it's like to be a teacher in the younger grades at school when they learn the part of Chumash about Lot and his daughters. It's a very uncomfortable story and it's pretty graphic. This is the book of our great inspiration. And so it goes. And that's why, incidentally, there are critics of the Jewish nation who turn and say, read the Bible and you'll see that you're a failed group of people. Because every time somebody is rebelling against something, serving some idol, disregarding what God says, complaining about the food. So does that sound like a deeply spiritual book to us? This is the question. Ve'af, in spite of the fact shehaTorah nislapsha bidvorim tachtonim gashmiyim, in spite of the fact that the Torah manifests the word tachtonim is lowly, in very lowly materialistic terms. You don't expect that in a book of spiritual enlightenment, half of the characters behave in the most disgusting ways. This one's running off with his daughters, and that one's stealing somebody else's wife, and these people are bowing down to a golden image, etc. And you don't expect that the whole legal section of Judaism is going to deal with the kind of person who would ever have the idea of burning his neighbor's field with the neighbor inside. We understand that you have to have those areas of law you have to be able to deal with it should it happen, but that's not what you expect to pore over for hours on end in the pursuit of spiritual enlightenment. So this is a big question, and it's something that stymies many, many people, and it's the reason that people love to learn Kabbalah. And by the way, anybody who pronounces it that way is not learning the real deal. So what do people want? They want something that's going to speak to the soul and tell me about some spiritual version of chakras and something about channeling energies and about how to become a better person and pay $26 for a bottle of water, and then you are a mystic. Why? Because we naturally expect that if there's going to be something that is so profound and so enlightening, it must speak that language. And here is a very important shift of focus and understanding. Harezes, in order to illustrate this point, the Alter Rebbe, the author of Tanya, is going to use a particular parable, a particular mashal. What's the mashal? What's the parable? Harezeh, the person who studies Torah, and the Torah happens to be either a story or a scenario that seems to be so very materialistic. Harezeh kemechavek es hamelech derech mashal. This should be compared to a person has an opportunity, however that opportunity arises, a person has an opportunity to embrace the king. Okay, now king is quite an abstract concept for us, right? Unless you're an Elvis fan. But most people today, we don't relate to the idea of a king. In those days, where they lived in monarchies, the king was off limits to the average person, not only to the average person. In order to get anywhere close to the king, first of all, you would have had to have been a person of stature. Second of all, you would have had to have a reason to see the king. Thirdly, you would have had to make an appointment and probably waited a number of months before you had that opportunity to see the king. So they appreciated and understood just how distant the average person is from the king. Now imagine in that society, imagine the thought of embracing the king. Now, probably the closest thing that we have to this is if you happen to be a royal watcher, as some people are, and so you pay attention to the royal family in England, or perhaps you live elsewhere in Europe where there is in fact a royal family. So if somehow you had the opportunity to go and visit the king or the queen of a particular country, you know that you're not getting anywhere close to shaking their hand. You're going to be trained, and everybody will tell you when you walk in, you're going to bow like this or curtsy like that. And they're going to tell you that these are the words you're allowed to say, and this is how you address Her Royal Highness. You're not shaking hands. And you certainly are not going to go in for the big bear hug, like a group of Hasidim. Hey, Your Highness, give a hug. We're not going to do that. So, can you imagine what degree of intimacy, what degree of closeness, what degree of relationship there would have to be with somebody and the monarch to be able to hug the monarch? Just imagine that for a second, because it's completely unthinkable. I mean, you wonder, when you watch these people, you wonder if that royal family even is allowed to embrace each other, right? Because everything is so orchestrated and so choreographed. So imagine the level of closeness to be allowed to hug the monarch. Let's imagine that somebody got there. For whatever reason, however it is that they did it, they were given permission, or more than permission. Imagine the king calls this person over and says, come, I want to embrace you. You've done something, or you are someone who is so meaningful in my life. I want to embrace you. This is an amazing moment. The monarch wants to embrace you. So the person walks over, feeling that this is the highlight of their entire life. The king leans in, wraps them in his arms, and gives them this tight, meaningful hug. You can imagine what that person will feel like. They will walk on air probably for the rest of their life. They'll tell that story wherever they go to, whoever is willing to hear it, more than once. How many people in the world could ever claim such a thing? This person will feel like the most treasured member of the kingdom. Now, whenever that happens, you can be absolutely guaranteed that there'll be at least one nudnik somewhere in the crowd. So this person comes out of the palace, goes back home, tells the family, you cannot believe what happened. I'm bowled over. The love that the king showed me, the way that the king embraced me, it was absolutely amazing. It was a transformational moment. I actually feel now that I'm worth something special. And the nudnik in the family says, so what was the king wearing? What was the king wearing? What do you mean, what's the difference? No. Because the way I see it, when you went to visit the king, it was a formal audience. And in the formal audience, the king wears that very formal jacket. You know, that formal red or white jacket with all the medals all over the place. If the king really cared and really loved you, he would have taken off the jacket. Because that jacket is almost like a barrier, It's so stiff, it's starched. It's that scratchy material, It's got all those medals on, which are effectively like some kind of armor plating to keep a distance between you and the king. I don't think the king really, really cares and loves you as much as you think. Because if the king really loved you, the king would have removed the jacket first. You'd say, are you Meshuggah? Are you off the wall? Since when do we limit sentiment by how many layers of clothing somebody happens to wear? Can you imagine if you have, now people are starting, thank God, to travel again after 2 years of no travel. So imagine you've got a family member you haven't seen since before COVID. And either you go visit them or they come visit you. Imagine. Now we all know how emotional airports can be at the best of times. Imagine you're standing there waiting for them to come. You haven't seen them in 2 years. You're waiting at the arrivals hall. The next thing, the doors open and there they are. And they come rushing to you and you rush to them and you both extend your arms and you embrace and you give a big hug. And then you say, after 2 years of not seeing me, I really thought you would first take off your coat before you walked out of that arrivals chamber so that I could hug you. Now you came. I know that was winter where you came from and it's summer over here, but I don't feel like I hugged you. I hugged the coat. It's that thick winter coat that you have on it. You're sugar. Are you crazy? You're like, what are you talking about? Since when do you define the degree of intimacy between two people, the love, the emotion, the sentiment between two people, by how many layers of clothing they happen to be wearing at that particular moment? It's a meshugas. Says the Alter Rebbe, she'ein hefresh, there will be absolutely no distinction, b'ma'alas, to the caliber of his skarvusoi, of the closeness, udveikusoi, and the connection, b'melech, between yourself and the king, bein mechavkoi keshehu lavush echad, whether the king embraces you while wearing one layer of clothing, bein shu lavush kama lavushim, or whether he's wearing many layers of clothing. It's absolutely irrelevant. Me'achar sheguf hamelech besoicham, because what counts is that the king is inside that clothing. So who cares how much clothing it is? What is Torah? So through the course of this chapter, we've started to introduce the principle, which we will develop far more in far greater detail in the next chapter. But we've developed the principle which says Torah is Hashem presenting himself to us and allowing us, using our intellectual faculties, to embrace him. That's what Torah is. Now you will notice that up until this point, we've spoken equally about Torah and mitzvahs as connection points between us and God. But this is where we're focusing in specifically on Torah, as we will continue to do in the next chapter. Because there's something unique that happens in terms of the connection between one person and the next when that connection involves the intellect. Let's think of it this way. And as I say, we'll develop this further in the next chapter. But let's think of it this way. So imagine you want to know something. You want to know about a particular person. You're about to enter into a business deal with a particular person, and you want to understand who exactly you're getting involved with. So, of course, you'll do some background checks, and you'll do your due diligence, and you'll ask questions, whatever. But when you actually meet that person, oh, of course, I forgot the main thing. You'll stalk them on Facebook. And then you'll have the opportunity to actually see them, to meet them. So when a person walks into your office, let's just say that you've got one of these offices where you can see out over the whole building. You know, like a real controlling boss would want to have. You know, you've got this glass-paneled office. You can see all of your employees. They feel almost that you're godlike, the eye that sees, So you watch the person walk in through the front door. And you watch how they walk, how they interact with the other people that they meet, people at reception. Maybe there's a security guard they have to get past. Maybe they bump into some of your employees along the way. And you watch the whole thing. You can't hear a word. You watch the whole interaction, the physical movement of this person. How much do you now know about this person from observing them? Well, you'll know certain things. You'll know, first of all, something about their physical fitness, because if the person walks easily versus if the person limps into the room, so you can tell you can have a perspective on their physical fitness. You'll have a perspective on how confident they feel walking into that building. So they might walk in with a stride, square shoulders, chin up, or they might walk in and you can see that they're feeling a little bit uncomfortable and shifting a little bit, and whatever the case is. Now that doesn't tell you anything about the person. It tells you about how the person feels now in this environment. So that's the most superficial way that we could really engage with or connect or understand somebody else, is by watching their mannerisms and their gestures. And yes, so there's a whole science to nonverbal communication and body language, and it's all valuable in the moment, right? So, for example, they'll tell you, very often, there's certain basics of body language that everybody knows. So, for example, they'll tell you, if a person goes like this while they're talking, they might be concealing something, might not be telling the truth. It's very possible. Or they might have allergies. It's also possible. So, it's a science, but it's not necessarily going to give you the holistic picture about everything that you need to know about an individual. So what do? You invite them into your office, you sit them down, and you start to talk. Now, of course, once you start to talk to a person, you will learn more about them than you would just from observing their gestures and their mannerisms. Because as the expression goes, the pasuk says, Nafsha yotza b'davroi. There's this concept that a person's soul leaks out in their words. It's a beautiful expression, right? That the kind of person that you are, you can't really hide in the way that you speak. It tends to emerge. Like somebody I was chatting to earlier today, and they said, they wanted to make a point, so they said, is it okay if I swear? So the person who had accompanied them said, no, this is the rabbi, you can't talk that way. But even just saying that already tells us a little bit about what kind of a person that is, the kind of person who, clearly that's part of how you talk, which in turn tells us about what level of refinement a person has. So once you start to talk to somebody, you learn a little bit more about them. The reality, though, is that people are very, very good at disguising themselves in their words. That's why we have con men. That's why we have politicians. People who know how to speak in a particular way because that's what they believe that you need to hear. So if you really want to understand a person in a deeper, more meaningful way, you want to try and understand, what do they feel? Are they generally the kind of person who feels a lot of anxiety? Are they the kind of person who feels calm? Are they the kind of person who feels a lot of goodness and benevolence and generosity to those around them? Or are they the kind of person who's very protective and quite withdrawn? That will tell me a lot more about a person. Once I start to understand how a person feels, it will tell me a lot more. But the ultimate experience of connection with somebody is an intellectual connection. That doesn't just mean that you talk about subjects, academic subjects, because that could be quite superficial. But when you start to allow yourself to get into somebody's head and you allow them to get into your head, that develops a very, very meaningful relationship. Unfortunately, in today's world, we so often see couples who started off their married life so healthy and so connected and so happy and so loving. And then you fast forward 20 odd years, and sometimes much less, and the wheels have come off and the relationship is falling apart. And very often when you speak to these couples, they themselves don't know what happened. They have this nostalgic view of how it was. They have this frustrated experience of how it is. And they're not quite sure what happened in between. And when you start to unpack it, very often what you find, especially with modern couples, is that they do a lot of the right things because they've seen Dr. Phil tell you that you should do this, or they read that particular book about what you should do. So they do a lot of the right things, but they start living in two different heads. Very often, the man lives in a business mind, and the woman lives in a family mind. Now, that's a huge generalization, but very often that's what happens. And the woman doesn't really understand business, but she would like to know what's going on and what her husband does and how the business operates. And the man doesn't quite have the sensitivity to family as a woman does. And he would like to know a little bit better and understand a little bit better, how he could be a better father, how he could be more engaged. But very often what happens is they lock each other out. So she'll ask him, so what's happening with this new deal that you're doing in your business? And he's like, you won't understand it. Just trust me about it. It's going to be good for us. And very often she'll say, I'm really worried about this one of our children because I think that they might need a little bit of extra help at school and they might need a little bit of therapy or whatever. And he's like, but explain, I don't understand. I don't see how you're seeing that. She says, don't worry. It's a mother's intuition. Just trust me on it. And people start to lock each other out intellectually. And that is very damaging to a relationship. So the converse is, when you invite somebody in intellectually, that's not just that you're trading ideas, but you invite somebody into your mind, how you think, that creates a very meaningful intimacy between people. So Hashem invites us into that space. And that might be one of the reasons that we consistently refer to God and us with a metaphor of husband and wife. Because the intention is to create a very intimate relationship. And even though that sounds impossible, because God is infinite and we're finite, and our means of processing is to simplify, which effectively means to make things more finite. And in order to access Hashem, you have to become less finite. So it does seem like an impossible task. So Hashem invites us in, and he says, you know what I'm going to do for you? I'm going to do something that is, it's not even rational. I'm going to present my mind, which earlier at the beginning of the chapter we learned is myself, because Hashem and his mind are indistinguishable. So Hashem says, I'm going to present myself, which is fundamentally infinite, in language that you'll recognize and appreciate. I'm going to talk your language. And regularly, through the commentaries of the sages in the Midrashim and in the Talmud, we regularly see the expression, the Torah speaks the language of humans. And this is what we mean. The Torah speaks the language of humans. We do this to our children. We want to make ourselves available to them. We want to be able to have a relationship with them. And we know that in order to do that, we have to speak language they can relate to. So when you've got a baby, you're quite comfortable to go goo goo gaga with the baby. You don't feel like I've now become less of a human because of this. You understand that I want this intimate relationship, and I know the only way to do it is I have to present myself in language the baby will understand. That doesn't mean I'm less of myself, and it doesn't mean that I'm investing less me in that interaction. In fact, it might be one of the deepest interactions I have in my whole life. So if you have an individual who's a professor who lectures on some deep, abstract academic topic, at that point, when the professor is sharing such developed sophistication, they're not necessarily sharing their deepest self. And that same professor can then come home to his baby and go goo goo gaga, and at that moment be expressing the essence of himself. This is the gift of Torah. The gift of Torah is Hashem says, I want to give myself to you. That's how they interpret the first word of the Ten Commandments. Anoichi. I is an abbreviation for 4 words. Ano, nafshi, ksavis, Yehavis. I have taken my soul, written it into this book, and given it to you. So Torah is Hashem saying, I want to give myself to you. I want to embrace you. Don't be distracted by how many layers of filter I use so that you can actually be part of that embrace. Because if the neuroscience professor comes home and says to his baby of 6 months old, I really want to bond with you, so I'm going to tell you what I taught my students today, there will be no intimate connection. So if Hashem would come to us and say, I want to share myself with you on my terms, it would be a non-starter. So he wraps himself in this layer after layer of ordinary, relatable stories and scenarios that you and I can study. And in doing that, he allows himself to embrace us. Or I should say, in this case, he allows us to embrace him. And then he continues, the Alter Rebbe, V'chein ima melech mechabkoi bizroi oi. Likewise, so that if you embrace the king, it's irrelevant how many layers of clothing the king is wearing. Likewise, if the king embraces you, if the king embraces you with his arm, same issue. It is equally irrelevant if that arm is wearing layers or gloves or whatever it is. It's insignificant. It's the gesture and the sentiment and motivation behind the gesture that counts, not the physical clothing that he happens to be wearing. All of this is represented in one verse. As the pasuk tells us, V'minoi techabekeni. It's a verse from King Solomon, as we know very well. King Solomon in Shir HaShirim describes this romantic relationship of husband and wife, which is metaphoric of Hashem's relationship with us. And he says in this particular pasuk, S'moi lo tachas leroishi. He places his left hand under my head. We're not going to discuss why that is. You'll see that the Alter Rebbe has left out that part of the verse because it's not something we need to analyze now. There are many other places in Chassidus that analyze that part of the verse in much more detail. The part that we focus on is Viminoi techabkeni, and his right arm embraces me. So it looks like this very romantic tzedek of this man with his hand under this woman's head, and then he embraces her with his right arm. But Viminoi techabkeni shehi ha-Torah is metaphoric of the Torah. That entire romantic Shir HaShirim is all metaphoric of Hashem's relationship with us and how Hashem wants an intimate connection and he wants to bind with us. And specifically, he uses his right hand to embrace us, shehi ha-Torah, because the right hand is symbolic of the Torah. Shenitna miyamin, as the verse says in the last parasha of the Torah, Hashem gave us the Torah with his right hand. The verse says, Mi minoi eish das lomoi. From his right hand, he gave the law in fire to his people. Why is Torah associated specifically with the right hand? She bechinas chesed umayim. Because the right hand is the side that is associated with chesed, generosity, and it is associated with the element of water, which we've already used as a metaphor in this chapter. We said that Torah is compared to water because water will always flow from the highest to the lowest point, not just to a lower, but to the lowest point. And that's exactly what Torah is. It's taking the infinite divine wisdom and allowing it to flow down to the lowest point, a conversation about promiscuity or theft or murder or how to pay your taxes. Very lowly things. Why did Hashem do that? Because it's the ultimate expression of chesed, of his kindness. Chesed, kindness, means you want to share with others. Either you want to share your resources, or on a far deeper level, you want to share yourself. The Torah is Hashem saying, I want to share myself with you. Here's where you're going to gain access. This is me extending my arm. This is my reach to you. All you need to do is embrace it, which you do through study. And when you do that, you actually become intimately bound up with Hashem, which is what we'll describe in far more detail in the next chapter. So that's why the soul needs the capacity for thought and speech and action, but now we're focused on thought, because without it, how can the soul learn Torah? And if you can't learn Torah, you might be very spiritual, but you're not plugged in to the infinite essence of God.